She was chained to the hitching post in the blazing Arizona sun, her dress torn and bloodied, lips cracked from thirst. The outlaw Blackjack Morrison had made his warning crystal clear to the entire town of Copper Falls. No one dares to help her, or you'll hang by sunrise. But an Apache warrior named Cocheta was about to prove that some threats mean nothing when honor calls. The morning heat already shimmered off the dusty main street of Copper Falls when Lucinda Torres was dragged from the Wells Fargo office, iron shackles cutting into her wrists. The town folks scattered like tumbleweeds in a storm, mothers pulling children behind storefronts, men suddenly finding urgent business indoors. Nobody wanted to see what Blackjack Morrison had planned, but nobody dared look away either. Morrison stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn leather boots, a man carved from desert stone and bad intentions. His black duster coat hung open despite the heat, revealing twin Colt 45s that had sent more men to their graves than cholera. A thick scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a cavalry saber that had failed to finish the job 10 years prior. His pale blue eyes held the cold emptiness of a winter sky, and when he smiled, which he did often, it carried all the warmth of a sidewinder's kiss. Lucinda had made the mistake of witnessing something she shouldn't have. 3 nights ago, she'd been riding back from her family's cattle ranch when she spotted Morrison and his gang dividing stolen gold from the Tucson bank robbery. She'd recognized the distinctive leather bags marked with the bank's seal, the same bags the territorial marshal had described in the wanted posters plastered across every saloon and general store within 100 miles. What she couldn't have known was that Morrison had seen her watching from the ridge overlooking Devil's Canyon. Now she paid the price for being in the wrong place, with working eyes and a functioning memory. Morrison had ridden into Copper Falls at dawn with 8 of his most vicious men, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth like the drums of approaching war. They'd surrounded the Torres family ranch, burned the barn, scattered the cattle, and put a bullet through the shoulder of Miguel Torres when he'd tried to protect his daughter. Lucinda's father lay bleeding in Dr. Henderson's makeshift clinic, while his daughter faced a fate that would make death seem like mercy. The outlaw leader had chosen the town's main street for his spectacle, positioning Lucinda directly in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where the maximum number of witnesses could observe his demonstration of absolute power. The hitching post he'd chained her to had been crafted from sturdy oak, designed to hold the weight of the finest horses money could buy. Now it served as an instrument of torture, the metal rings burning hot enough to blister skin at the slightest touch. Morrison's voice carried across the dusty street like the crack of a bullwhip, each word carefully measured to extract maximum fear from his captive audience. "This here señorita saw something that weren't meant for her pretty brown eyes," he announced, his boot heels clicking against the wooden sidewalk as he paced before the terrified townspeople. "Now, I could just put a bullet in her head and be done with it, but that wouldn't teach you all the lesson you need to learn about minding your own damn business." The outlaw's plan was diabolically simple and devastatingly effective. He would leave Lucinda chained in the merciless desert sun, without water or shade, until she died of thirst and exposure. The process would take days, maybe a week if she was particularly stubborn about dying. Every person in Copper Falls would have to walk past her suffering body to conduct their daily business, a constant reminder of what happened to those who crossed Blackjack Morrison. More importantly, it would serve as a test of the town's submission to his will. "Anyone who gives her so much as a drop of water," Morrison continued, his pale eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk searching for movement in tall grass. "Anyone who offers her shade or comfort or tries to set her free will hang from that cottonwood tree before the sun rises tomorrow morning. I'll make sure of it personally, and I'll make sure you watch your neighbors die before it's your turn to dance on air." The threat wasn't empty bluster or the desperate boasting of a man trying to appear more dangerous than he truly was. Morrison had built his reputation on following through with exactly these kinds of promises. In Tombstone, he'd hanged 3 men for helping a wounded cavalry soldier reach medical treatment. In Phoenix, he'd burned down an entire church because the preacher had offered sanctuary to a family Morrison wanted to rob. The territorial authorities had placed a $5,000 bounty on his head, but no lawman had ever gotten close enough to collect it. Sheriff William Crawford stood frozen on the courthouse steps, his hand resting on his holstered Remington, but making no move to draw the weapon. Crawford was a good man in most situations, brave enough when facing cattle rustlers or drunk cowboys, but Morrison represented a level of violence and ruthlessness that existed beyond the sheriff's experience or capability. The Outlaw commanded 8 seasoned killers, each one worth 3 ordinary gunmen in a fight, while Crawford had only his elderly deputy and whatever citizens might be willing to stand with him. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Morrison's gang could slaughter every man in Copper Falls and ride away without breaking a sweat. The women and children would be left defenseless at the mercy of men who viewed mercy as a weakness to be exploited. Crawford had seen what remained of towns that had tried to resist Morrison's demands, and the memory of those blackened ruins and unmarked graves kept his pistol in its leather holster. Dr. Richard Henderson emerged from his clinic, his white hair disheveled and his usually steady hands trembling with suppressed rage. He'd spent the morning digging buckshot out of Miguel Torres' shoulder while listening to the man's desperate pleas to save his daughter. Henderson had taken an oath to do no harm and preserve life, but that oath meant nothing if helping Lucinda would result in Morrison massacring half the town. The doctor's medical bag sat heavy in his grip, filled with water and laudanum that could ease the girl's suffering, but he dared not take a single step toward the hitching post. Lucinda herself remained surprisingly composed despite her desperate circumstances. She'd inherited her father's stubborn pride and her mother's quiet strength, qualities that had served her well during the difficult years following her mother's death from influenza. She understood that Morrison intended to use her as an object lesson for the town, a demonstration that his will was absolute and resistance was futile. But she also understood something that Morrison might have overlooked in his arrogant confidence. The Torres family had lived in this region for 3 generations, long before American settlers had arrived to establish Copper Falls. Lucinda's grandfather had been a vaquero who'd learned to survive in the harsh desert by making allies rather than enemies, by showing respect for the Apache bands who considered this territory their ancestral home. Her father had continued that tradition, often trading cattle and supplies with Apache families in exchange for information about water sources and safe passage through dangerous country. This relationship with the Apache had made the Torres family somewhat unusual among the Mexican and American settlers in the area. Most ranchers viewed the Apache as savage enemies to be fought and driven away, but the Torres family understood that the desert was vast enough for everyone if mutual respect could be maintained. They'd never cheated an Apache trader, never broken a promise made to Apache leaders, and never participated in the brutal military campaigns that had devastated Apache communities throughout Arizona territory. Morrison's men began spreading out along the main street, taking positions that would allow them to control every avenue of approach to the hitching post. Dutch Williams, Morrison's second-in-command, stationed himself directly across from Lucinda with his Winchester rifle cradled in his arms. Dutch had earned his nickname not from any European heritage, but from his habit of splitting the skulls of his victims with a tomahawk, a practice he claimed he'd learned from hostile Indians during his years as a cavalry deserter. The other gang members took similar positions, creating an invisible perimeter of death around their suffering prisoner. Scarface, Pete positioned himself near the general store, his twin revolvers prominently displayed in cross-draw holsters. Iron Mike stood guard outside the saloon, a sawed-off shotgun hanging from a leather sling across his massive chest. Snake. Ice Morrison, the boss's younger brother, found a vantage point on the hotel balcony where his sharpshooter's rifle could command a view of the entire street. Each of these men had earned their reputations through years of violence and brutality. They'd robbed banks, rustled cattle, murdered travelers, and terrorized settlements across 3 territories. They followed Blackjack Morrison not out of loyalty or friendship, but because his leadership had made them all wealthy and his protection had kept them alive. They would kill anyone who threatened their comfortable arrangement without hesitation or remorse. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless Arizona sky, and Lucinda's suffering began in earnest. The metal shackles had already begun to burn her wrists where they touched her olive-toned skin. Her dark hair, normally braided neatly down her back, hung in disheveled strands across her face, providing little protection from the relentless solar assault. The torn fabric of her riding dress offered no shade, and the wooden hitching post behind her radiated heat like a baker's oven. Mrs. Sarah Martinez, who ran the boarding house at the end of the street, watched from her upstairs window with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She'd known Lucinda since the girl was old enough to ride into town with her father, had watched her grow from a shy child into a confident young woman who could rope a steer as well as any vaquero. The sight of such a good girl suffering for the crime of having eyes and a conscience filled Mrs. Martinez with a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. But rage without power was merely another form of torture. Mrs. Martinez had 2 young grandsons staying with her for the summer, and their safety had to take precedence over her desire to help Lucinda. Morrison's threat wasn't directed only at the person who might offer aid. It extended to anyone who might sympathize with such aid. The outlaw's paranoia ran deep enough that he might interpret even a show of compassion as a form of resistance worthy of hanging. Father Miguel Santos stood in the doorway of the Catholic Church, his priest's robes providing little protection. From the moral heat of the moment, he'd baptized Lucinda as an infant, had given her first communion, had watched her kneel in prayer every Sunday since her mother's death. The girl was as faithful a Catholic as could be found in the entire territory. A young woman who lived her faith through acts of charity and kindness to those less fortunate. The priest's vows required him to offer comfort to the suffering and aid to the innocent, but Morrison's presence had created a situation where following those vows might result in the massacre of his entire congregation. Father Santos could imagine the headlines in the territorial newspapers: Outlaw gang slaughters congregation after priest defies orders. The scandal would destroy the church's ability to serve the spiritual needs of the community, leaving families without the sacraments and children without religious education. As the morning wore on and the temperature continued to rise, Lucinda's condition began to deteriorate visibly. Her lips, already cracked from the dry desert air, began to split and bleed. Dark circles appeared under her eyes as dehydration started affecting her circulation. Her normally straight posture began to sag as the combination of heat exhaustion and despair took their toll on her body and spirit. The townspeople found themselves trapped in a horrible dilemma that tested every principle they claimed to hold dear. Their shared Christian faith demanded that they help a neighbor in distress, but their survival instinct warned that such help would result in their own deaths and the deaths of their families. Morrison had engineered the perfect moral trap, a situation where doing right would lead to catastrophic consequences, while doing wrong would preserve the greater good. But Morrison's perfect plan contained one flaw that his arrogance prevented him from recognizing. The outlaw leader understood greed, fear, and violence, but he had no comprehension of honor that existed beyond the reach of threats and bribes. He could intimidate American settlers and Mexican ranchers, but he'd never encountered the particular brand of courage that burned in the heart of an Apache warrior who'd witnessed an injustice against someone her people considered a friend. Cochetta had been watching the town of Copper Falls from a mesa 3 miles to the east since, before dawn, studying the patterns of movement through her grandfather's spyglass. The Apache scout had originally come to trade information about cavalry movements with Miguel Torres, part of an arrangement that had kept both their families safer during the ongoing conflicts between Apache bands and American military forces. She'd observed Morrison's gang ride into town, had seen the smoke rising from the burning barn at the Torres ranch, and had witnessed Lucinda's capture through the magnifying lens. The Apache warrior understood immediately that this situation represented more than simple criminality. Morrison was using Lucinda to break the spirit of an entire community, to demonstrate that American law and Mexican tradition and Christian charity were all powerless against sufficient ruthlessness. If such a demonstration succeeded, it would encourage other outlaws to adopt similar tactics, making life impossible for peaceful people throughout the territory. Cochetta had learned warfare from her uncle, a veteran of countless battles against Mexican soldiers and American cavalry units. She understood tactics and strategy, knew how to move unseen across hostile terrain, and could shoot straighter than most men with either rifle or bow. But more than tactical skill, she possessed something that Morrison's gang lacked entirely, a code of honor that valued courage over survival and principle over profit. The Apache way of war differed fundamentally from the European traditions that had shaped American and Mexican military thinking. Where white soldiers fought for political causes or economic advantage, Apache warriors fought to protect their people and maintain their honor. An Apache who witnessed injustice and failed to act would face social disgrace worse than death, particularly if the injustice involved someone who had shown respect and friendship to Apache families. As the sun reached its zenith and Lucinda's suffering intensified, Cochetta began her descent from the mesa toward Copper Falls. She moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, her moccasined feet finding purchase on rock faces that would challenge experienced climbers. Her weapons were few, but perfectly suited to her mission. A recurved bow made from mountain sheephorn, 24 arrows fletched with hawk feathers, and a knife forged from Spanish steel that had been in her family for 3 generations. The Apache warrior's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would infiltrate the town, eliminate Morrison's sentries one by one, and create enough chaos to allow Lucinda's rescue. The plan would almost certainly result in Cochetta's own death, as 8 professional gunmen represented overwhelming odds, even for a warrior of her skill. But the certainty of death didn't alter her moral obligation to act, and Apache tradition taught that a death in defense of honor was preferable to a life lived in shame. By afternoon, Lucinda had lapsed into semi-consciousness, her head lolling forward as heat exhaustion began shutting down her body's systems. The townspeople had retreated indoors to escape both the physical heat and the moral heat of witnessing suffering they felt powerless to address. Morrison's men remained at their posts, but their attention had begun to wander as the hours passed without incident. That wandering attention would prove to be their fatal mistake, for Cochetta had reached the outskirts of Copper Falls and was beginning her approach to the main street. The Apache warrior moved through shadows and blind spots with supernatural stealth, closing the distance between herself and Morrison's gang one careful step at a time. She understood that she would have only one chance to strike before the outlaws organized their defense, and that chance would need to count for everything. Cochetta's first kill came without warning or mercy. Snake eyes. Morrison never saw the arrow that punched through his throat as he lounged on the hotel balcony, his sharpshooter's rifle forgotten as he dozed in the afternoon heat. The projectile struck with such force that it pinned him to the wooden chair, his eyes widening in shock before the life drained from them like water from a cracked bucket. His rifle clattered to the balcony floor, but the sound was masked by the creaking of the hotel's old timber frame. The Apache warrior had scaled the back wall of the hotel using nothing but fingertip cracks in the adobe mortar and the iron brackets that held the building's rain gutters. Her movements were so fluid and silent that even the ravens perched on the roof remained undisturbed. She'd learned this style of climbing from her grandmother, who had once scaled the walls of a Spanish mission to rescue captured Apache children. What had taken her grandmother hours of careful preparation, Cochetta accomplished in mere minutes. From the hotel balcony, Cochetta could see the entire layout of Morrison's trap. Dutch Williams remained positioned across from Lucinda with his Winchester, but his attention was focused on a poker game visible through the saloon's batwing doors. Scarface Pete had found shade beside the general store, his twin revolvers, holstered while he whittled a piece of cedar with a bone-handled knife. Iron Mike stood guard outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, but he'd propped his massive frame against a support post and appeared to be fighting off sleep. The Apache Scouts. Tactical assessment revealed both strengths and weaknesses in Morrison's defensive arrangement. The outlaws had positioned themselves to prevent any direct approach to Lucinda, but they'd grown complacent during the long hours of inaction. More critically, their positions were designed to stop a frontal assault by multiple attackers, not to defend against a single infiltrator who could strike from unexpected angles. Blackjack Morrison himself had retreated into the saloon's cool interior, leaving his men to maintain the watch while he enjoyed whiskey and the company of several painted women who'd arrived on the morning stage. His arrogance had led him to believe that his reputation alone would be sufficient to maintain order, that no one in Copper Falls possessed either the courage or the capability to challenge his authority. This assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Cochetta retrieved Snake Eye's rifle and ammunition, recognizing the weapon as a modified Spencer repeating rifle capable of accurate fire at distances exceeding 500 yards. The dead outlaw had wrapped the stock in rawhide for better grip and had filed the trigger mechanism to reduce pull weight. These modifications suggested that Snake Eyes had been Morrison's designated marksman responsible for eliminating threats at long range. The loss of their sharpshooter would severely compromise the gang's ability to control the approaches to Copper Falls. Without high ground observation and long-range firepower, Morrison's men would be vulnerable to attacks from the surrounding hills and mesa formations. Cochetta understood that eliminating Snake Eyes had been the crucial first step in leveling the tactical playing field. Her second target required a different approach entirely. Scarface Pete's position beside the general store offered multiple escape routes, but also provided concealment for an attacker willing to use the building's shadows. Cochetta descended from the hotel using the same route she'd climbed, then worked her way along the back alleys that connected Copper Falls' main buildings. These narrow passages were littered with refuse and construction debris, but they offered complete concealment from the street. The Apache warrior's knowledge of urban warfare had been learned during the siege of Tucson 3 years earlier, when Apache bands had coordinated attacks against American military installations throughout southern Arizona. She'd observed how buildings could be used as cover, how alleyways could become channels for flanking maneuvers, and how the geometric arrangement of a settlement could be turned against its defenders. Scarface Pete's death came as he reached for his water canteen, his throat opened by Cochetta's Spanish steel blade before he could cry out for help. The outlaw's body slumped forward against the general store's wall, his blood soaking into the dusty earth. Cochetta wiped her knife clean on Pete's bandana, then appropriated his twin Colt .45 revolvers and the ammunition belt that circled his waist. The weapons were well maintained and fully loaded, suggesting that Pete had been a professional gunman who took pride in his equipment. The revolver's grips were worn smooth from constant handling, and the barrels showed the kind of careful cleaning that indicated regular use. These weren't the guns of a casual criminal, but of a man who'd survived by being faster and more accurate than his opponents. With two of Morrison's sentries eliminated, Cochetta turned her attention to Iron Mike, the massive outlaw guarding the saloon entrance. This target presented the greatest challenge yet, as Mike's size and strength made him dangerous even in close combat, and his position near the saloon's entrance meant that any commotion would immediately alert Morrison and the remaining gang members. The Apache warrior studied Mike's routine from the concealment of a water trough positioned diagonally across the street. The big man shifted his weight every few minutes, adjusted his shotgun's position, and occasionally glanced toward the saloon doors as laughter and music drifted from the interior. His weakness appeared to be curiosity. He kept trying to see what was happening inside the establishment he was supposed to be guarding. Cochetta's plan required split-second timing and absolute precision. She would use one of Pete's revolvers to create a distraction on the opposite side of the street, drawing Mike's attention away from his post. When the big man turned to investigate the sound, she would strike with her bow from close range. The arrow would need to find a vital target despite Mike's thick clothing and substantial body mass. The distraction worked perfectly. When Cochetta's bullet shattered a window in the courthouse across the street, Mike immediately swiveled toward the sound, his shotgun rising to a ready position. The Apache warrior's arrow took him in the back of the neck, the razor-sharp obsidian point severing his spinal cord and dropping him instantly. His massive body crashed to the wooden sidewalk with enough force to rattle the saloon's windows. The sound of Iron Mike's fall finally penetrated the noise barrier created by the saloon's festivities. Morrison's voice could be heard shouting questions from inside the building, demanding to know what had caused the disturbance. Dutch Williams abandoned his position across from Lucinda and moved cautiously toward the saloon, his Winchester rifle held at port arms. This movement created the opening that Cochetta had been working toward since the beginning of her assault. With Dutch no longer covering the hitching post, the Apache warrior had a clear approach to Lucinda's position. She sprinted across the open street, her moccasined feet making no sound on the packed earth, her stolen revolvers ready for immediate use. Lucinda's condition had deteriorated significantly during the hours of exposure to the desert sun. Her skin had reddened and begun to blister where the metal shackles had contact with her wrists and ankles. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, indicating the onset of serious heat exhaustion. Her eyes remained closed, but she stirred weakly. When Cochetta knelt beside her, the Apache warrior spoke in fluent Spanish, words learned during trading expeditions with Mexican ranchers like Miguel Torres. "Hold still, hermana," she whispered, using the knife to work at the shackle locks. "Your father sent word to my people. We do not abandon our friends." The locks were crude but effective, designed more for intimidation than security. Cochetta's blade found the weak points in the mechanism. Behind them, Morrison's voice grew louder and more agitated as he emerged from the saloon to discover Iron Mike's body sprawled on the sidewalk. The outlaw leader's pale blue eyes swept the street, searching for threats, while his right hand rested on the grip of his holstered Colt. Dutch Williams had taken cover behind a water trough, his rifle trained on the various shadowed areas where an attacker might be concealed. The remaining gang members began emerging from their hiding places throughout the town. Crazy Jim Hawkins appeared in the doorway of the barbershop, his sawed-off shotgun ready for action. Mexican Bob Valdez stepped out from behind the blacksmith's forge, twin pistols drawn. Tommy, the Kid Morrison, Blackjack's nephew, positioned himself on the steps of the courthouse with his father's old Navy Colt. Cochetta realized that she had perhaps 30 seconds before the outlaws organized their search and discovered her location beside the hitching post. Lucinda's shackles were proving more resistant than expected, the crude iron requiring careful manipulation to avoid breaking the knife blade. The Apache warrior's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but the seconds were ticking away faster than her progress. "There!" Dutch Williams shouted, his rifle swinging toward the hitching post as he spotted movement in the shadows. "Someone's at the girl!" His Winchester barked once, the bullet splintering wood inches from Cochetta's head. The Apache warrior rolled sideways, drawing both of Pete's revolvers as she moved, her body shielding Lucinda from the incoming fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The street exploded into chaos as Morrison's gang opened fire from multiple directions. Bullets whistled through the air like angry hornets, striking the hitching post, the buildings behind it, and the dusty ground around Cochetta's position. The Apache warrior returned fire with both revolvers, forcing the outlaws to seek better cover while she continued working on Lucinda's restraints. Morrison himself joined the firefight, his twin Colts bucking in his hands as he advanced across the street with the confidence of a man who'd survived dozens of similar battles. His accuracy was impressive, even while moving, his bullets coming dangerously close to their intended target. The outlaw leader's pale eyes burned with fury at the audacity of someone challenging his authority. "Kill them both!" Morrison shouted, over the gunfire. "I want that Apache's scalp hanging from my saddle, and I want the Mexican bitch's body left for the buzzards." His words carried across the street, despite the noise of battle, revealing the depth of his rage at being defied by someone he considered racially inferior. But Morrison had made a critical tactical error in his anger. By ordering his men to kill both Lucinda and her rescuer, he'd eliminated any possibility of using the captive as leverage or a human shield. This meant that Cochetta could fight without restraint, using whatever methods were necessary to protect both herself and the woman she'd come to save. The Apache warrior's combat training had emphasized mobility and adaptability over static defense. She used the hitching post as cover while returning fire, but she also kept moving, denying the outlaws a stable target while gradually working her way toward better defensive positions. Her arrows had been replaced by lead bullets, but her tactical thinking remained fundamentally Apache. Dutch Williams made the mistake of exposing too much of his body while reloading his Winchester. Cochetta's bullet caught him in the center of his chest, the impact spinning him around and dropping him behind the water trough. His rifle clattered away across the wooden sidewalk, leaving him armed with only a short-barreled revolver that was useless at his current range. The loss of Dutch's rifle fire gave Cochetta the breathing room she needed to complete her work on Lucinda's shackles. The last lock clicked open just as Mexican Bob's bullets began chewing splinters from the hitching post directly above their heads. The Apache warrior gathered Lucinda in her arms, the young woman's weight surprisingly light due to dehydration and exhaustion. "Can you walk?" Cochetta asked in Spanish, helping Lucinda to her feet behind the minimal cover provided by the oak post. The Mexican woman nodded weakly, though her legs trembled with the effort of standing. Her ordeal had taken a severe physical toll, but her spirit remained unbroken. Morrison realized that his prey was about to escape and intensified his assault, advancing closer to the hitching post while firing rapidly with both revolvers. His bullets struck the post with enough force to send splinters flying in all directions, several fragments drawing blood from Cochetta's exposed arms. The outlaw leader's marksmanship was improving as the range decreased. The Apache warrior knew that remaining in their current position meant certain death for both herself and Lucinda. She needed to reach the alley behind the general store, where the narrow passage would limit the number of attackers who could engage them simultaneously. The distance was only 30 yards, but it might as well have been 30 miles with Morrison's gang controlling the open ground. Cochetta's solution was characteristically Apache in its boldness and simplicity. She would create maximum chaos and confusion, then use the resulting disorder to cover their escape. The Spencer rifle she'd taken from Snake Eyes was still loaded, and its heavy bullets would punch through the wooden walls of the surrounding buildings. The Apache warrior's covering fire was devastating in its intensity and accuracy. Her shots shattered windows, splintered doorframes, and sent Morrison's men diving for whatever cover they could find. More importantly, the heavy rifle bullets penetrated the thin wooden walls of the buildings, forcing the outlaws to abandon positions they'd thought were secure. Under cover of this suppressing fire, Cochetta half-carried Lucinda toward the alley, both women moving as quickly as the Mexican woman's weakened condition would allow. Behind them, Morrison's rage-filled curses mixed with the sound of gunfire and splintering wood as the outlaw leader realized his captive was escaping. Tommy, the kid. Morrison tried to intercept their retreat, stepping into the mouth of the alley with his Navy Colt drawn. Cochetta's bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall of the barbershop. The young outlaw's gun hand went numb, and his revolver fell unfired to the dusty ground. The alley provided temporary sanctuary, but Cochetta understood that Morrison would reorganize his remaining men and pursue them within minutes. She needed to find a more defensible position where she could tend to Lucinda's condition while planning their next move. The Apache warrior's knowledge of Copper Fall's layout came from careful observation during her approach to the town. Behind the general store stood a small adobe structure that had once served as a storage shed for grain and supplies. The building's thick walls would provide protection from small arms fire, and its single door could be easily defended against multiple attackers. More importantly, the structure had a clear view of the back alley while offering concealment from the main street. As they reached this temporary refuge, Lucinda's strength finally gave out completely. The young woman collapsed against the adobe wall, her breathing labored and her skin dangerously flushed from heat exposure. Cochetta realized that without immediate medical attention, Miguel Torres' daughter might not survive the rescue that had been intended to save her life. The Apache warrior's field medical training was limited but practical. She'd learned to treat wounds and heat exhaustion during the long campaigns against Mexican and American military forces. Water was the immediate priority. Lucinda's body was shutting down from dehydration, and without fluid replacement, she would soon lapse into unconsciousness. Cochetta's water supply was limited to a single buffalo hide canteen, but she poured half of its contents between Lucinda's cracked lips, while using the remainder to cool the Mexican woman's overheated skin. The relief was immediate but temporary. Lucinda's condition would continue deteriorating unless she could be moved to proper shelter and medical care. From their position behind the storage shed, Cochetta could hear Morrison rallying his surviving men for a systematic search of the alley system. The outlaw leader's voice carried clearly in the desert air, his words promising brutal death to anyone who harbored or assisted the escaped prisoner. His fury had reached the point where tactical considerations were being overwhelmed by the need for immediate vengeance. The Apache warrior checked her remaining ammunition while considering their options. She had perhaps a dozen bullets left for the revolvers and 3 rounds remaining in the Spencer rifle. Against 4 or 5 determined gunmen, this would be insufficient for a prolonged battle. She needed either reinforcements or a dramatic change in the tactical situation. That change was about to come from an unexpected source, as the townspeople of Copper Falls had been watching the gun battle from behind shuttered windows and locked doors. Sheriff Crawford had observed Cochetta's rescue attempt with growing amazement, recognizing both the skill and courage required to challenge Morrison's gang single-handedly. The Apache woman's actions had accomplished something that the sheriff had thought impossible. She'd proven that Morrison was not invincible. Dr. Henderson had also been watching, his medical bag ready despite the danger. When he saw Cochetta, Helping Lucinda toward the alley, the physician realized that the young woman would need immediate treatment if she was to survive her ordeal. His oath to preserve life was finally stronger than his fear of Morrison's retribution. The stage was set for the next phase of the battle as Copper Falls began to wake from its paralysis of fear. Dr. Henderson made his choice when he saw Cochetta dragging Lucinda's unconscious form into the adobe storage shed. The physician had spent 30 years practicing medicine on the frontier, had stitched up gunshot wounds by lamplight, delivered babies during Apache raids, and amputated limbs without anesthesia when gangrene set in. He understood that some situations demanded action regardless of personal consequences, and watching a young woman die of heat exhaustion while he possessed the means to save her crossed every line his conscience had drawn. The doctor's medical bag contained everything needed to treat severe dehydration, laudanum for pain, salts to restore electrolyte balance, and most critically, a full bottle of purified water that he'd boiled that morning for surgical procedures. Henderson had also packed clean bandages, carbolic acid for disinfection, and a small bottle of whiskey that served double duty as both antiseptic and anesthetic. His hands might shake with age, but his knowledge remained sharp as a surgical blade. Sheriff Crawford watched Dr. Henderson slip out the back door of his clinic and disappear into the maze of alleys behind Main Street. The lawman understood that the physician was risking everything to provide medical care to Lucinda Torres, and that Morrison would view such aid as direct defiance of his explicit orders. Crawford's own moment of decision had arrived. He could continue hiding behind the pretense of being outgunned, or he could remember why he'd pinned on a badge in the first place. The sheriff's office contained a gun rack holding 3 Winchester rifles, 2 shotguns, and sufficient ammunition to arm a small militia. More importantly, Crawford's desk drawer held a stack of federal warrants for Morrison and his gang, each carrying a substantial bounty and explicit authorization for any lawman to use deadly force in their apprehension. The territorial governor had specifically requested that local authorities take aggressive action against outlaw bands terrorizing frontier communities. Crawford's deputy, elderly Pete Jameson, emerged from the jail's back room, carrying his old cavalry carbine and wearing an expression of grim determination. Jameson had served with distinction during the Apache Wars and understood both tactics and courage under fire. His weathered hands might be slower than they once were, but his aim remained true, and his loyalty to Crawford was absolute. "To earn our pay, Sheriff," Jameson said, checking the carbine's action with practiced efficiency. "That Apache girl's shown more guts than this whole town put together. Least we can do is back her play." His voice carried the steady calm of a man who'd faced death before and found it less frightening than dishonor. Father Santos had been wrestling with his conscience since Morrison first chained Lucinda to the hitching post. The priest's theological training had taught him that God sometimes worked through unlikely instruments to accomplish divine justice, and he was beginning to suspect that Cochetta's intervention represented exactly such a moment. The Apache warrior's courage had shamed the entire Christian community into recognizing their own moral cowardice. The Catholic Church's bell tower provided an excellent vantage point overlooking the entire town, and Father Santos had been using his field glasses to observe Morrison's movements during the gun battle. The priest had counted the gang's numbers, noted their positions, and identified their tactical weaknesses with the analytical mind of someone who'd studied military strategy during his seminary training in Mexico City. More importantly, Father Santos possessed something that Morrison's gang lacked: detailed knowledge of every building, alley, and hiding place in Copper Falls. The priest had visited every family in town, had blessed every home, and had conducted funerals in every cemetery plot. This intimate familiarity with the community's geography could prove invaluable in planning coordinated resistance against the outlaws. Mrs. Sarah Martinez had reached her breaking point while watching Cochetta's desperate fight to save Lucinda. The boarding house owner had lost her own daughter to cholera 5 years earlier, and the sight of another young woman suffering while good people stood paralyzed triggered memories that burned like acid in her chest. Martinez's late husband had been a vaquero who taught her to shoot, and his Henry rifle still hung loaded above their bedroom fireplace. The boarding house's second-floor windows commanded excellent fields of fire covering both the main street and the network of alleys where Morrison's men were conducting their search. Martinez had positioned herself at the corner window, her husband's rifle steady on the windowsill, waiting for a clear shot at any outlaw who threatened the Apache warrior or her rescued prisoner. Tommy, the Kid Morrison, sat bleeding against the barbershop wall, his wounded shoulder sending waves of agony through his young body with each heartbeat. The teenager had joined his uncle's gang, seeking adventure and easy money, but the reality of outlaw life was proving far more brutal than the dime novels had suggested. Watching Cochetta systematically eliminate seasoned gunmen had shattered Tommy's romantic illusions about criminal glory. The wounded young outlaw found himself facing a terrible choice between family loyalty and personal survival. His uncle's rage had reached murderous intensity, and Morrison's next assault would likely result in massive casualties among both his own men and innocent townspeople. Tommy possessed information about the gang's tactical plans that could save lives, but betraying Blackjack would mark him for death if his uncle survived the coming battle. Morrison himself had taken shelter inside the Silver Dollar Saloon while organizing his remaining forces for a final assault on the storage shed. The outlaw leader's tactical situation had deteriorated dramatically. He'd lost half his men to a single Apache warrior. His reputation for invincibility had been shattered, and now he faced the possibility that Copper Falls' citizens might find enough courage to join the fight against him. The saloon's interior provided good defensive positions, but also represented a trap if the townspeople decided to surround the building. Morrison's remaining men, Crazy Jim Hawkins, Mexican Bob Valdez, and 2 newer recruits called Arizona Pete and Durango Dan, were professional killers, but lacked the tactical sophistication needed for urban warfare against multiple opponents. Occupying fortified positions, Blackjack's strategy was characteristically brutal in its simplicity. He would burn the storage shed with Cochetta and Lucinda trapped inside, then massacre any townspeople who attempted to interfere with the execution. The saloon's bar contained several bottles of high-proof whiskey that would serve as improvised incendiary devices, and the outlaws had located enough lamp oil to create a devastating fire. But Morrison had underestimated the psychological impact of Cochetta's successful rescue mission. The Apache warrior's actions had shattered the spell of helplessness that had paralyzed Copper Falls, proving that Morrison's gang could be fought and defeated. Townspeople who had cowered in terror for hours were beginning to remember their own capacity for courage and collective action. Dr. Henderson reached the storage shed just as Lucinda's condition reached critical levels. The young woman's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Her skin had taken on a dangerous grayish pallor, and her pulse was racing far faster than normal. Without immediate fluid replacement and electrolyte correction, she would lapse into irreversible shock within the hour. Cochetta had done everything possible with her limited medical knowledge, but the Apache warrior recognized that Lucinda needed treatment beyond anything she could provide. When Dr. Henderson appeared at the shed's entrance with his black leather medical bag, Cochetta lowered her revolvers and gestured him inside with relief evident in her dark eyes. "How bad?" Henderson asked in Spanish, kneeling beside Lucinda's unconscious form and immediately beginning his examination. His experienced hands checked her pulse, lifted her eyelids to examine pupil response, and tested her skin elasticity to assess dehydration levels. The diagnosis was grim, but not hopeless. "She needs fluids, salts, and cooling," the doctor explained to Cochetta while preparing his treatments. "The heat exposure has pushed her body beyond its normal recovery capacity, but if we can stabilize her condition within the next few minutes, she should survive." His words carried the authority of 3 decades treating similar cases on the unforgiving frontier. Henderson's treatment was swift and professional. He administered water and salt solution to combat dehydration, used wet cloths to reduce Lucinda's dangerously elevated body temperature, and injected a small amount of laudanum to ease the pain from her rope burns and heat blisters. Within minutes, Lucinda's breathing improved, and her pulse began stabilizing. The medical intervention was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the main street. Morrison's men had begun their incendiary assault, hurling bottles filled with whiskey and lamp oil against the buildings surrounding the storage shed. The improvised firebombs exploded in pools of blue flame that quickly spread across the dry wooden structures. Sheriff Crawford's voice rang out across the smoke-filled air, amplified by the speaking trumpet he used for crowd control during cattle drives and public gatherings. "Blackjack Morrison, you and your men are under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. Surrender now, and you'll get a fair trial." The sheriff's words carried the weight of legitimate authority challenging criminal tyranny. Morrison's response was a stream of profanity that would have embarrassed a cavalry sergeant, followed by a volley of gunfire directed at Crawford's position behind the courthouse steps. The outlaw leader's rage had completely overcome his tactical judgment, leading him to waste ammunition on long-range shots that had little chance of hitting their intended targets. Father Santos had positioned himself in the church bell tower, with an old Sharp's buffalo rifle that had belonged to his predecessor, a former cavalry chaplain who'd served during the Indian Wars. The priest's military training had taught him both marksmanship and the moral framework for righteous violence in defense of the innocent. His first shot shattered a whiskey bottle in Mexican Bob's hand, preventing the outlaw from adding to the growing conflagration. Mrs. Martinez opened fire from her boarding house window, her husband's Henry rifle barking repeatedly as she laid down, suppressing fire to prevent Morrison's men from advancing toward the storage shed. Her shooting was accurate enough to keep the outlaws pinned behind their inadequate cover, buying precious time for Dr. Henderson to complete Lucinda's treatment. The coordinated resistance from multiple townspeople created exactly the tactical situation that Morrison had hoped to avoid. Instead of facing a single opponent who could be isolated and overwhelmed, his gang now confronted attacks from several directions simultaneously. The outlaws' numerical advantage was being negated by the defenders' superior positions and local knowledge. Crazy Jim Hawkins made the fatal mistake of attempting to flank Sheriff Crawford's position by moving through the alley behind the courthouse. Deputy Jameson's cavalry carbine caught him in the open, the heavy bullet punching through his chest and dropping him face down in the dust. The old soldier's aim remained as deadly as it had been during his military service. Arizona. Pete tried to silence Mrs. Martinez's harassing fire by storming the boarding house's front entrance, but the widow had anticipated such a move. Her shotgun blast from the top of the stairs cut him down before he could climb halfway to the second floor. The boarding house's narrow stairway had become a killing funnel that channeled attackers into a lethal crossfire. Morrison realized that his tactical situation had become untenable. Half his remaining men were dead or wounded, the townspeople had overcome their paralyzing fear, and legitimate law enforcement was finally asserting its authority. The outlaw leader's options had narrowed to escape or annihilation, and his survival instincts were beginning to overcome his homicidal rage. But Morrison's reputation had been built on never retreating from a fight, and backing down now would destroy his credibility with other outlaw bands throughout the territory. Every desperate criminal who'd ever considered joining his gang would view retreat as evidence that Blackjack Morrison had lost his nerve. This psychological factor might prove more important than tactical considerations. Tommy the Kid. Morrison stumbled into the storage shed, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side and his young face pale with shock and blood loss. The teenager looked at Cocheta with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, recognizing that the Apache warrior represented his only chance of survival. His uncle's rage would not distinguish between enemies and family members who'd failed to prove their loyalty. "He's going to kill everyone," Tommy whispered to Cocheta in broken Spanish. Learned during childhood visits to Mexican relatives. Uncle Jack's gone loco with anger. He's got dynamite hidden in his saddlebags, enough to blow up half the town. He'd rather die than let that Apache squaw make him look weak. The teenager's words carried the authenticity of insider knowledge. Cocheta's tactical assessment shifted immediately upon learning about the dynamite threat. Morrison's willingness to use explosives changed the entire character of the battle, transforming it from a conventional gunfight into a potential massacre of innocent civilians. The Apache warrior realized that she could no longer focus solely on protecting Lucinda. The entire community was now at risk. Dr. Henderson had succeeded in stabilizing Lucinda's condition sufficiently for transportation, but moving her would require a stretcher and at least 2 able-bodied carriers. The young woman remained conscious but weak, capable of limited movement but unable to walk any significant distance. Any evacuation plan would need to account for her medical limitations. The storage shed's adobe walls provided good protection against small arms fire, but they would offer no defense against dynamite explosions. Cocheta realized that their current position had become a trap rather than a refuge, and that Morrison's next assault would likely prove fatal for everyone inside the structure. Sheriff Crawford had reached the same conclusion about the deteriorating tactical situation. His speaking trumpet carried a new message across the smoke and gunfire. "All citizens take cover in stone buildings immediately. Morrison has explosives." The sheriff's warning triggered a desperate scramble as townspeople abandoned wooden structures for the more substantial protection offered by the bank, courthouse, and church. Father Santos began ringing the church bells in the traditional pattern that warned of fire or Indian attack, a signal that would alert every rancher and miner within 5 miles of Copper Falls. The bronze bell's deep tones carried across the desert landscape, their urgent rhythm calling for assistance from anyone within hearing distance. The priest understood that the battle's outcome might depend on reinforcements arriving before Morrison could implement his explosive plan. Mexican Bob Valdez had worked his way around to the back of the storage shed, carrying a stick of dynamite with a short fuse already attached. The outlaw's plan was simple: light the fuse, throw the explosive through the shed's single window, and eliminate both Cocheta and her rescued prisoner in one devastating blast. His approach had gone unnoticed during the confusion of the broader battle. Durango Dan provided covering fire for Valdez's flanking maneuver, his rifle keeping the townspeople pinned down while his partner prepared the dynamite assault. The two outlaws had worked together on previous raids and understood each other's tactical preferences without need for verbal communication. Their coordination represented the last remnant of Morrison's once formidable gang, but Tommy Morrison's betrayal of his uncle's plans had given the defenders a crucial intelligence advantage. Cocheta understood exactly what Morrison intended and had positioned herself to counter the expected dynamite attack. Her bow was strung and ready, an obsidian-tipped arrow nocked and drawn to full extension. The Apache warrior's shot took Mexican Bob in the throat just as his match touched the dynamite's fuse. The dying outlaw's reflexive grip caused him to clutch the explosive device against his chest as he fell, the burning fuse disappearing beneath his body. Cocheta had perhaps 10 seconds to get everyone clear before the dynamite detonated. "Run!" she shouted in both English and Spanish, grabbing Lucinda under one arm while Dr. Henderson supported the other side. Tommy Morrison stumbled ahead of them toward the shed's door, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the face of imminent explosive death. Behind them, Mexican Bob's body convulsed as the burning fuse ate through the final inches of cord. The explosion that followed shattered windows throughout Copper Falls and sent a mushroom cloud of dust and debris rising into the desert sky. The adobe storage shed simply ceased to exist, its thick walls reduced to scattered fragments of clay and stone. The blast's concussion knocked everyone within 50 yards to the ground and temporarily deafened anyone closer to the epicenter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Cocheta had managed to get her group approximately 30 yards from the shed when the dynamite detonated. The shockwave knocked them sprawling, but the distance had been sufficient to prevent serious injury from the explosion itself. Flying debris peppered their location, but the worst fragments passed overhead or fell short of their position. Morrison's reaction to losing another of his men was immediate and predictable. The outlaw leader emerged from the saloon with his remaining dynamite, his pale eyes blazing with homicidal fury. Blackjack Morrison had reached the point where tactical considerations no longer mattered. He would destroy Copper Falls and everyone in it rather than accept defeat at the hands of an Apache woman. The stage was set for the final confrontation, as Morrison prepared to use his explosive advantage while the townspeople rallied around Cocheta's example of courage. Blackjack Morrison stood in the middle of Main Street, holding 3 sticks of dynamite bound together with rawhide, his pale blue eyes reflecting the flames that had begun consuming the eastern end of Copper Falls. The outlaw leader had crossed the line from criminal desperation into homicidal madness, his reputation and sanity both shattered by an Apache woman who refused to acknowledge his authority. The bundled explosives in his hands contained enough power to level every building within a 100-yard radius. Cocheta crouched behind the overturned water trough that had provided Dutch Williams his final cover. Her captured Spencer rifle trained on Morrison's chest while she calculated angles and distances with the precision of a born hunter. The Apache warrior understood that a single shot would need to drop the outlaw leader instantly before his dying reflexes could trigger the dynamite that would incinerate everyone on the street. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, each heartbeat measured against the possibility of sudden death. Sheriff Crawford had positioned himself behind the courthouse steps with Deputy Jameson, both lawmen holding rifles, but neither daring to fire, while Morrison clutched the bundled explosives. A single bullet hitting the dynamite would create a blast that would shatter every window in town and rain debris for half a mile in every direction. The sheriff's tactical training told him to take the shot, but his responsibility to protect innocent civilians demanded restraint. Morrison's surviving gang members, Durango Dan and Arizona Pete, had taken cover behind the Silver Dollar. Saloons overturned poker tables, their weapons trained on the various townspeople who had found courage enough to join the fight. The remaining outlaws understood that their leader's sanity had finally snapped completely, but their own survival depended on maintaining loyalty until the bitter end. Abandoning Morrison now would mark them for death by every outlaw band west of the Mississippi. Dr. Henderson continued treating Lucinda behind the dubious shelter of a horse trough, his medical bag spread open on the dusty ground while he worked to stabilize her condition sufficiently for evacuation. The young woman had regained consciousness but remained dangerously weak, her body still recovering from hours of exposure to the desert sun. Moving her before Morrison's explosive threat was resolved would risk her life as surely as staying. In place, Father Santos had descended from the bell tower and taken position in the church doorway, his buffalo rifle providing covering fire for any townspeople who needed to reach safer positions. The priest had sent his altar boy racing toward the surrounding ranches with orders to summon every armed man within riding distance. Reinforcements were coming, but they might arrive too late to affect the battle's outcome. Mrs. Martinez maintained her vigil at the boarding house window, her husband's Henry rifle ready to support whatever action the other defenders might take. The widow had counted her remaining ammunition and realized she possessed perhaps a dozen cartridges, enough for one more serious engagement, but insufficient for a prolonged siege. Her position commanded excellent fields of fire, but offered no escape route if Morrison decided to target the boarding house with dynamite. Tommy Morrison had crawled behind the ruins of the adobe storage shed, his wounded shoulder sending waves of agony through his young body with each movement. The teenager understood that his betrayal of his uncle's plans had marked him for death regardless of the battle's outcome. His only hope for survival lay in Morrison's defeat and the possibility that the townspeople might show mercy to someone who had helped them. The tactical stalemate stretched across several agonizing minutes as both sides recognized the deadly mathematics of their situation. Morrison possessed the power to destroy everyone on the street, but using that power would guarantee his own death in the explosion. The defenders had sufficient firepower to kill the outlaw leader, but any shot that failed to drop him instantly would result in catastrophic civilian casualties. Morrison broke the silence with a voice that carried across the burning town like the howl of a desert wind. "You think you've won something here, Apache." His words were directed at Cocheta, but intended for the entire community. "You think saving one Mexican girl makes you some kind of hero? I'll show you what happens to people who cross blackjack." "Morrison!" The outlaw leader's grip tightened on the dynamite bundle. Cocheta's response came not in words, but in action. The Apache warrior had spotted a weakness in Morrison's position that others had missed. The outlaw leader was standing directly in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon's large mirror, and the angle of the afternoon sun created a reflected glare that was affecting his vision. More importantly, the mirror's surface would magnify any muzzle flash, temporarily blinding Morrison at the crucial moment. The Apache woman's first shot was not aimed at Morrison himself, but at the saloon's window. Directly behind his position, the bullet shattered the glass in an explosion of crystalline fragments that caught the sunlight like 1,000 tiny stars. The sudden flash of reflected light caused Morrison to flinch instinctively, his eyes squinting against the glare while his grip on the dynamite loosened fractionally. That fractional loosening was all Cocheta needed. Her second shot, fired less than 2 seconds after the first, took Morrison in the center of his chest with enough force to knock him backward off his feet. The outlaw leader's dying hands reflexively opened as he fell, sending the dynamite bundle flying through the air toward the burning buildings at the street's eastern end. Sheriff Crawford's voice rang out across the chaos. "Everyone down!" The lawman's warning gave the defenders precious seconds to seek cover before the dynamite exploded against the side of the barber shop, the blast tearing a massive hole in the building's wooden wall and sending flaming debris raining across the entire street. The concussion shattered every remaining window in Copper Falls and knocked several people unconscious. Durango Dan made his final stand in the doorway of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his revolvers bucking in his hands as he poured. Lead toward Cocheta's position behind the water trough. The outlaw's marksmanship was excellent, despite the chaos surrounding him, his bullets chipping splinters from the trough's wooden rim and forcing the Apache warrior to keep her head down. Deputy Jameson ended Dan's resistance with a single shot from his cavalry carbine, the heavy bullet punching through the outlaw's ribs and dropping him across the saloon's threshold. The old soldier's aim remained as steady as it had been during his military service, and his tactical instincts told him to eliminate threats in order of their immediate danger to civilian lives. Arizona. Pete attempted to surrender when he realized that Morrison was dead and Dan had fallen, but Mrs. Martinez's rifle spoke before the outlaw could drop his weapons. The boarding house widow had lost too many friends to outlaw violence over the years to show mercy to someone who had participated in terrorizing her community. Her husband's Henry rifle delivered justice with cold precision. The sudden silence that followed the last gunshot seemed almost supernatural after hours of continuous violence and chaos. Smoke drifted across Main Street from the burning buildings, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of burning wood and adobe. Bodies lay scattered across the dusty ground like discarded puppets, their blood already being absorbed by the thirsty desert earth. Cochetta rose slowly from behind. The water trough, her captured weapons still ready for use but no longer needed. The Apache warrior's dark eyes surveyed the battlefield with the analytical gaze of someone trained to assess tactical situations. Morrison's gang had been completely eliminated, but the cost in property damage and civilian trauma would affect Copper Falls for years to come. Dr. Henderson immediately rushed to check on the wounded, his medical bag in hand as he moved from body to body searching for anyone who might still be saved. The physician's training had taught him that the minutes following a battle often determined who lived and who died, and his oath to preserve life extended even to wounded enemies who might survive with proper treatment. Sheriff Crawford holstered his smoking rifle and began the grim task of identifying bodies and assessing the legal aftermath of the gun battle. The lawman understood that territorial authorities would demand detailed reports explaining how a single outlaw gang had managed to terrorize an entire town and cause such extensive property damage. His own actions would be subject to scrutiny by federal marshals and territorial officials. Father Santos emerged from the church to begin administering last rites to the dead, regardless of whether they had been outlaws or townspeople. The Dihad priest's theological training had taught him that death was a universal experience that transcended the moral categories that divided the living. His Latin prayers drifted across the battlefield like benedictions for souls departing toward whatever judgment awaited them. Tommy Morrison lay bleeding behind the storage shed ruins, his young face pale with shock and his wounded shoulder requiring immediate medical attention. The teenager's betrayal of his uncle's plans had probably saved dozens of lives, but his outlaw associations would complicate any legal proceedings that followed the battle. His future depended on the mercy of people who had every reason to hate. The Morrison name, Lucinda Torres, had remained conscious throughout the final battle, her recovery aided by Dr. Henderson's medical treatment and her own determination to witness justice being served. The young woman's ordeal had transformed her from an innocent rancher's daughter into someone who understood the true cost of freedom and the courage required to defend it. Her testimony would be crucial in any legal proceedings that followed. Mrs. Martinez descended from her boarding house stronghold, her husband's rifle finally silent after hours of deadly work. The widow had discovered reserves of courage and marksmanship that she hadn't known she possessed, and her actions had helped turn the tide of battle when Morrison's gang seemed unstoppable. Her boarding house had become a fortress that protected the community's flank during the crucial engagement. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the true extent of Morrison's impact on Copper Falls. Several buildings were burning or damaged beyond repair. The main street was littered with debris and bloodstains, and traumatized citizens emerged from hiding places where they had cowered in terror for hours. The physical reconstruction would be challenging, but the psychological healing would take much longer. Cochetta found herself in an unusual position as the battle's aftermath unfolded around her. The Apache warrior had succeeded in her mission to rescue Lucinda Torres, but her actions had evolved far beyond a simple rescue operation. She had become the catalyst for a community's awakening from paralysis into collective action, proving that seemingly impossible odds could be overcome through courage and coordination. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of reinforcements summoned by Father Santos's message. A dozen armed ranchers and miners rode hard toward Copper Falls, their weapons ready and their faces grim with determination to help their neighbors. The men pulled up short when they saw the battle's aftermath, their expressions shifting from readiness to amazement as they surveyed the devastation. Miguel Torres rode at the head of the relief column, his wounded shoulder strapped and bandaged, but his determination to reach his daughter overriding any concerns about his own health. The rancher's eyes found Lucinda immediately, and his weathered face reflected relief so profound that it brought tears to the eyes of hardened men who had seen every form of frontier violence. "Misha," Torres whispered as he knelt beside his daughter, his calloused hands gentle as they checked her condition. "I thought I had lost you forever." His voice carried the weight of a father's worst nightmare, temporarily realized, then transformed into gratitude beyond expression. The reunion between father and daughter provided a moment of pure humanity amid the battlefield's carnage. Sheriff Crawford began organizing the cleanup effort, while Deputy Jameson started collecting weapons and evidence that would be needed for the official reports. The lawmen understood that federal authorities would want detailed documentation of how Morrison's gang had been eliminated, and their own actions would be subject to review by territorial officials who might question the level of violence that had been necessary. Dr. Henderson completed his examination of the wounded and announced that Tommy Morrison would survive if his shoulder wound received proper treatment. The physician's medical oath required him to provide care regardless of the patient's associations, but the teenager's future would depend on legal proceedings that could result in either clemency or execution. Father Santos gathered the surviving townspeople for a prayer of thanksgiving that acknowledged both their deliverance from Morrison's tyranny and the lives that had been lost during the battle. The priest's words reminded the community that victory had come at a significant cost, and that the responsibilities of freedom required constant vigilance against future threats. Cochetta prepared to depart Copper Falls as quietly as she had arrived, understanding that her mission was complete, and that remaining longer might complicate the community's efforts to return to normal life. The Apache warrior's code emphasized actions over recognition, and her personal satisfaction came from knowing that Lucinda Torres was safe rather than from any public acknowledgement of her heroism. But the townspeople had other ideas about allowing their savior to disappear without recognition. Sheriff Crawford approached Cochetta with an official territorial warrant appointing her as a special deputy marshal, complete with authority to pursue and apprehend wanted criminals throughout Arizona territory. The appointment came with a substantial salary and the backing of federal law enforcement. Mrs. Martinez presented Cochetta with her husband's Henry rifle as a token of gratitude and respect. The weapon was a family heirloom that had served faithfully during years of frontier dangers, and gifting it to the Apache warrior represented the highest honor that the widow could bestow. The rifle would serve Cochetta well in future battles against injustice. Dr. Henderson offered to teach Cochetta advanced medical techniques that would complement her existing field treatment knowledge. The physician recognized that someone with the Apache warrior's courage and tactical skills could save many lives if she possessed more sophisticated medical training. The offer represented a partnership between frontier medicine and traditional Apache healing wisdom. Father Santos blessed Cocheta's weapons and wished her safe travels, recognizing that divine providence had worked through her actions to deliver the community from evil. The priest's blessing carried the weight of official church recognition that transcended denominational boundaries, acknowledging courage and righteousness regardless of their cultural origins. Lucinda Torres embraced Cocheta with tears of gratitude, her words inadequate to express what the Apache warrior's sacrifice had meant to her and her family. The young woman understood that she owed her life to someone who had risked everything for a virtual stranger, and that such debt could never be fully repaid. As Cocheta prepared to mount her horse and ride back toward the mesas that had hidden her approach to Copper Falls, she turned to address the gathered townspeople one final time. Her words were few, but carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about courage, community, and the responsibilities that freedom demanded from those who would preserve it. Evil wins when good people choose fear over action, the Apache warrior said in clear Spanish that most of the crowd could understand. Today you learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together. Remember this lesson when the next test comes, because there will always be another test. Her words would be repeated and remembered long after she had vanished into the desert landscape. Federal Marshal William Garrett arrived in Copper Falls 3 days after the gun battle, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the smoking ruins and blood-stained streets that told the story of Morrison's final rampage. Garrett had been tracking the outlaw gang across 3 territories for 8 months, always arriving too late to prevent their crimes, but methodically documenting their trail of violence for the territorial court system. This was the first town he'd encountered where the residents had successfully fought back. The marshal's investigation began with Sheriff Crawford's detailed report, which documented every aspect of the battle from Morrison's initial arrival to the final elimination of his gang. Crawford had maintained meticulous records despite the chaos, understanding that federal authorities would demand comprehensive evidence to justify the level of violence that had been necessary. His deputy Jameson had sketched diagrams showing the positions of combatants and the sequence of events. Tommy Morrison's testimony provided crucial insights into the gang's operations and their systematic terrorization of frontier communities across Arizona territory. The wounded teenager had decided that cooperation with federal authorities offered his only chance of avoiding the hangman's noose, and his insider knowledge revealed the scope of his uncle's criminal enterprise. Tommy's information led to the recovery of stolen gold hidden in caches throughout the region. Dr. Henderson's medical reports documented the extent of Lucinda Torres's injuries and the systematic torture that Morrison had inflicted through exposure and dehydration. The physician's clinical language could not disguise the barbaric nature of the treatment, and his testimony would be crucial in any legal proceedings that might follow. Henderson had also examined the outlaw corpses and could testify to the precise nature of their wounds. Father Santos provided character witnesses for the townspeople who had participated in the battle, emphasizing their peaceful natures and their reluctance to resort to violence until all other options had been exhausted. The priest's testimony carried special weight with territorial officials, who recognized that clergy rarely endorsed violent resistance unless circumstances were truly desperate. Marshal Garrett's most challenging task was locating and interviewing Cocheta, who had vanished into the desert immediately after the battle's conclusion. The Apache warrior's actions had been central to Morrison's defeat, but her legal status remained complicated by the ongoing conflicts between Apache bands and territorial authorities. Garrett needed her testimony to complete his investigation, but finding her would require diplomatic negotiations with Apache leaders. The marshal's search led him to Miguel Torres's ranch, where he hoped to learn more about the relationship between the Torres family and the Apache communities in the region. Torres received Garrett with cautious hospitality, understanding that the federal officials' intentions might determine whether Conchetta faced prosecution or recognition for her heroic actions. That Apache woman saved my daughter's life and probably saved your whole territory from more of Morrison's violence, Torres told the marshal as they sat on his ranch house porch. She risked everything to help people she barely knew, and she asked for nothing in return. If your government wants to punish her for doing what your own lawmen couldn't accomplish, then justice has died in this desert. Torres' words carried the weight of a father's gratitude and a citizen's frustration with ineffective law enforcement. Lucinda Torres had recovered sufficiently from her ordeal to provide detailed testimony about Morrison's methods and the conditions she had endured while chained to the hitching post. Her account revealed the psychological warfare that Morrison had used to terrorize the entire community, demonstrating that his crimes extended far beyond simple robbery and assault. The young woman's courage in testifying would help ensure that similar tactics were treated seriously by territorial courts. Marshal Garrett's investigation also uncovered evidence that Morrison had been operating with tacit support from corrupt officials in several territorial counties. The outlaw's ability to move freely across jurisdictional boundaries and avoid capture for so long suggested protection from within the law enforcement community itself. This discovery would trigger a broader investigation that would eventually expose a network of corruption extending to the territorial capital. The recovered stolen gold from Morrison's caches totaled more than $40,000, representing the accumulated proceeds from dozens of bank robberies, stagecoach holdups, and ranch raids conducted over several years. The territorial government announced that reward money from Morrison's capture would be distributed among the Copper Falls citizens who had participated in the battle, providing compensation for their property losses and recognition of their heroism. Sheriff Crawford received official commendation from the territorial governor for his role in eliminating Morrison's gang, but the lawman remained troubled by the community's initial paralysis in the face of outlaw intimidation. Crawford had learned painful lessons about the importance of maintaining community morale and preparedness, and he began organizing citizen militia training to prevent future incidents. Mrs. Martinez used her share of the reward money to rebuild the boarding house with improved fortifications and better fields of fire from the upper windows. The widow had discovered reserves of courage and tactical ability that she hadn't known she possessed, and she was determined to be ready if other outlaws threatened her community. Her boarding house became an unofficial stronghold that other townspeople could rally around during emergencies. Dr. Henderson expanded his medical practice to include field treatment training for citizens who might need to provide emergency care during violent incidents. The physician had realized that frontier communities could not always depend on professional medical assistance during crises, and that basic trauma treatment knowledge could save lives. His classes became popular among ranchers and townspeople who recognized their practical value. Father Santos used the crisis as an opportunity to preach about the moral obligations of community members to protect each other from injustice. The priest's sermons drew larger congregations as people grappled with the ethical implications of their actions during Morrison's occupation of the town. Santos emphasized that courage was a Christian virtue that required practice and preparation. Tommy Morrison faced a military tribunal that would determine whether his cooperation with federal authorities outweighed his participation in his uncle's criminal activities. The teenager's testimony had been instrumental in recovering stolen property and exposing corruption, but territorial law required punishment for those who had participated in violent crimes. His fate would set precedents for how reformed outlaws might be treated by the justice system. The tribunal's proceedings revealed the complex factors that led young men to join outlaw gangs, including economic desperation, family pressure, and the glamorous mythology that surrounded successful criminals. Tommy's case became a symbol of whether the territorial justice system could distinguish between willing participants and those who had been coerced or misled into criminal behavior. Marshal Garrett finally located Cocheta through diplomatic channels established with Apache leaders who recognized the value of maintaining peaceful relationships with territorial authorities. The Apache warrior agreed to meet with Garrett at a neutral location, but only after receiving assurances that she would not be prosecuted for actions taken in defense of innocent civilians. The meeting between Cocheta and Marshal Garrett took place on a mesa overlooking Copper Falls, with both parties accompanied by witnesses who could ensure that any agreements reached would be honored by their respective communities. The Apache warrior's testimony provided crucial details about Morrison's tactical methods and the systematic nature of his gang's operations. Cocheta's account revealed that Morrison had been using information provided by corrupt officials to target specific communities and individuals, demonstrating that the outlaw leader had possessed inside knowledge about territorial law enforcement activities. This intelligence had allowed Morrison's gang to avoid capture, while maximizing their criminal profits through carefully planned raids. The Apache warrior declined Marshal Garrett's offer of an official position as a territorial scout, preferring to maintain her independence while remaining available to assist legitimate law enforcement efforts. Cocheta understood that accepting government employment might compromise her ability to help Apache families who faced unjust treatment from some territorial officials. Federal prosecutors used the evidence gathered by Marshal Garrett to bring charges against several territorial officials who had provided information to Morrison's gang in exchange for a percentage of stolen proceeds. These corruption cases would eventually reach the Supreme Court and establish important precedents about the responsibilities of government officials to protect rather than exploit the citizens they served. The territorial legislature passed new laws specifically addressing the tactics that Morrison had used to terrorize communities, making it a capital offense to use hostages as instruments of psychological warfare against civilian populations. The legislation was informally known as the Lucinda Torres Act, in recognition of her ordeal and the community response that had followed. Copper Falls began attracting new residents as word spread about the community's successful resistance to outlaw intimidation. Families seeking safety on the frontier recognized that a town whose citizens would fight for each other offered better protection than isolated homesteads. The population growth brought economic prosperity that helped fund reconstruction efforts. Mining companies and ranching operations increased their activities in the region around Copper Falls, confident that the community could provide security for their workers and investments. The economic development created jobs that attracted additional settlers and established the foundation for long-term prosperity. Morrison's defeat had transformed a terrorized community into a symbol of frontier resilience. Educational initiatives emerged as townspeople recognized that their children needed training in both academic subjects and practical skills that might be necessary for community defense. The school curriculum was expanded to include marksmanship, first aid, and basic military tactics alongside traditional subjects. These programs ensured that future generations would be better prepared to face frontier dangers. Religious leaders throughout the territory began using Copper Falls as an example of how Christian communities should respond to evil, emphasizing that faith required action as well as prayer when innocent lives were threatened. Father Santos became a sought-after speaker at regional religious gatherings, where he shared lessons learned during Morrison's occupation and the moral awakening that had followed. The story of Cocheta's intervention became part of Apache oral tradition told around campfires as an example of how honor transcended cultural boundaries and required action regardless of personal risk. Apache children learned that courage meant protecting the innocent, even when those innocents belonged to different tribes or nations. Mexican-American families throughout the Southwest heard about Miguel Torres' relationship with Apache communities and began seeking similar arrangements that would provide mutual protection and economic cooperation. These alliances helped reduce tensions between different cultural groups and created networks that could resist future outlaw threats. Medical professionals across the frontier adopted Dr. Henderson's protocols for treating heat exhaustion and dehydration, recognizing that such conditions were common in desert regions where criminals might use exposure as a form of torture. Henderson's documentation of Lucinda's treatment became standard reference material for frontier physicians. Women's groups throughout Arizona Territory organized self-defense training programs inspired by Mrs. Martinez's successful defense of her boarding house during the battle. These programs recognized that frontier women often faced dangers while their men were away, and that community defense required participation from all capable adults, regardless of gender. The rewards distributed to Copper Falls citizens were invested in community improvements that strengthened the town's defensive capabilities and economic foundation. New buildings were constructed with better materials and more strategic positioning, creating an urban layout that would be easier to defend against future threats. Tommy Morrison's trial concluded with a sentence that balanced punishment for his crimes with recognition of his cooperation in exposing corruption and recovering stolen property. The young man received 5 years in territorial prison, followed by supervised probation, during which he would be required to provide testimony in ongoing prosecutions of corrupt officials. Marshal Garrett's final report to territorial authorities recommended that communities throughout Arizona be provided with federal assistance in organizing citizen militia units that could respond to outlaw threats more effectively than individual law enforcement officers. His recommendations led to the establishment of training programs that would help prevent future incidents similar to Morrison's occupation of Copper Falls. The graves of Morrison's gang members were marked only with wooden crosses bearing their names and dates of death, providing minimal recognition for men who had terrorized frontier communities for years. Their burial in Copper Falls Cemetery served as a reminder that violence ultimately led to death and dishonor, rather than the wealth and fame that attracted followers to outlaw leaders. Lucinda Torres slowly recovered her physical strength during the weeks following her rescue, but the psychological impact of her ordeal would remain with her for years. The young woman's experience had taught her harsh lessons about the nature of evil and the importance of community solidarity in facing dangerous threats. Her testimony would continue helping prosecutors build cases against other outlaw gangs operating throughout the territory. As autumn arrived in Copper Falls, the community began planning memorial services for the anniversary of Morrison's defeat, recognizing that the date should be remembered as a turning point in their collective history. The ceremonies would honor both the courage of those who had fought and the wisdom of those who had found peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible problems. 25 years had passed since Blackjack Morrison's death in the dusty streets of Copper Falls, and the small frontier town had grown into a prosperous city of 8,000 residents, whose children learned the story of Cochetta's courage in school, alongside lessons about arithmetic and geography. The bronze statue in the town square depicted an Apache woman drawing her bow, her face turned toward the desert mountains where her people still lived free, while at her feet knelt a Mexican woman representing all those who had been saved by unexpected heroism. Lucinda Torres had become Lucinda Williams after marrying a territorial judge who understood that her experience surviving Morrison's brutality had given her unique insights into criminal psychology and victim advocacy. She now served as the territorial prosecutor, specializing in cases involving violence against women and children. Her courtroom presence commanding respect from judges who recognized her authority as someone who had faced evil and survived. The former captive's prosecution record was formidable. She had secured convictions against dozens of criminals who preyed on vulnerable populations, and her testimony had helped establish legal precedents that protected future victims from the systematic torture that Morrison had inflicted. Lucinda's office walls displayed photographs of families she had helped, their grateful faces testament to justice served by someone who understood suffering intimately. Dr. Henderson had passed away 5 years earlier, but his medical protocols for treating exposure and trauma had been adopted by physicians throughout the American Southwest. The old doctor's detailed documentation of Lucinda's condition during her rescue had become required reading in medical schools, where future physicians learned to recognize the signs of systematic abuse and torture. His legacy lived on in the countless lives saved by his pioneering treatment methods. Sheriff Crawford had retired to write his memoirs, which became the definitive account of Morrison's reign of terror and the community uprising that ended it. The former lawman's book was required reading in law enforcement training programs across multiple territories, where future peace officers learned about the importance of community trust and the dangers of allowing criminal intimidation to paralyze civic institutions. Father Santos had been promoted to bishop and traveled throughout the Southwest, establishing churches in communities that needed moral leadership. His sermons about the theology of righteous resistance had influenced an entire generation of clergy, who learned that Christian duty sometimes required physical courage in defense of the innocent. Santos's writings on faith and action became standard texts in seminary education. Mrs. Martinez had lived to see her boarding house become a historical landmark, where tourists paid to stay in the room where she had made her famous stand against Morrison's gang. The elderly widow enjoyed regaling visitors with stories of the gun battle, her aged hands still steady enough to demonstrate proper rifle technique. Her grandchildren had inherited both her courage and her marksmanship skills. Tommy Morrison had served his prison sentence and emerged as a reformed man who dedicated his life to preventing other young people from following his path into criminal behavior. His autobiography, Riding with the Devil, My Life in Blackjack Morrison's Gang, had become a bestseller that earned him enough money to fund educational programs for at-risk youth throughout Arizona Territory. The former outlaw's transformation was genuine and complete. He had married a schoolteacher, raised 3 children who became respected professionals, and established himself as a successful businessman whose past was known but forgiven by a community that valued redemption. Tommy's story proved that even those who had participated in Morrison's crimes could find paths toward honorable lives. Marshal Garrett had been promoted to Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the Southwestern Territories, and his innovations in community-based crime prevention had become standard policy throughout the expanding United States. Garrett's recognition that local citizens were the most effective deterrent to criminal activity had revolutionized federal law enforcement philosophy. The Marshal's final report on the Morrison case had been studied by criminologists at Harvard University and the University of Chicago, where scholars analyzed the social dynamics that allowed small criminal groups to terrorize much larger populations. Garrett's insights about the psychology of intimidation had influenced academic understanding of criminal behavior patterns. Cocheta had become a legend among Apache bands throughout the Southwest, her story told around countless campfires, as an example of how honor transcended tribal boundaries and demanded action in defense of justice. Young Apache warriors learned that true courage meant protecting the innocent regardless of their cultural background, and that heroism was measured by service rather than personal glory. The Apache warrior had lived to see the establishment of formal treaties between her people and the territorial government, agreements that recognized Apache sovereignty while establishing mutual defense pacts against criminal organizations that threatened both communities. Cocheta's intervention in Copper Falls had helped demonstrate that Apache and American interests could align when justice was at stake. Educational institutions throughout the territory had established scholarship programs named in honor of the key participants in Morrison's defeat, providing opportunities for students whose families had been affected by outlaw violence. The Cocheta Fellowship supported Native American students pursuing careers in law enforcement, while the Torres Scholarship assisted Mexican-American women entering legal professions. The Henderson Medical Fund provided training for frontier physicians who served isolated communities where professional medical care was scarce. Dr. Henderson's belief that medical knowledge should be shared rather than hoarded had inspired a generation of physicians who viewed their profession as a calling rather than merely a means of earning income. Museums in Denver, Santa Fe, and Phoenix displayed artifacts from Morrison's gang, including the weapons captured during the Copper Falls battle and the shackles that had been used to torture Lucinda Torres. These exhibits educated visitors about the brutal realities of frontier life, while honoring those who had risked everything to defend their communities. The story of Morrison's defeat had inspired novelists and playwrights who recognized the dramatic power of ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage when faced with seemingly impossible odds. These fictional adaptations often emphasize themes of community solidarity and cross-cultural cooperation that reflected the real event's most important lessons. Railroad companies building lines through Arizona Territory specifically routed their tracks through Copper Falls in recognition of the community's reputation for reliability and security. The town's proven ability to defend itself against criminal threats made it an ideal location for supply depots and maintenance facilities that required protection from outlaw raids. Mining operations throughout the region employed security consultants who had studied the tactical lessons of Morrison's defeat, learning how small defensive forces could defeat larger attacking groups through superior positioning and coordination. The battle had become a textbook example of effective community defense that was studied in military academies. Women's suffrage organizations throughout the American West cited Mrs. Martinez's heroism as evidence that women possessed the courage and tactical ability to participate fully in community defense and civic leadership. Her example had helped convince territorial legislators that women deserved voting rights and equal participation in democratic institutions. The Apache-Mexican cooperation that had made Cocheta's rescue mission possible had evolved into broader alliances between different cultural groups throughout the Southwest. These partnerships had reduced intercultural tensions while creating networks that could respond effectively to criminal threats that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Churches throughout the territory had established interfaith councils that brought together Catholic, Protestant, and traditional Apache religious leaders to coordinate responses to community crises. Father Santos's example of principled leadership during Morrison's occupation had demonstrated the importance of moral authority in rallying civilian resistance to criminal intimidation. Legal scholars at territorial universities had written extensively about the precedents established by Morrison's prosecution, particularly the recognition that psychological warfare against civilian populations constituted a form of terrorism that warranted severe punishment. These academic analyses had influenced legislation throughout the expanding American frontier. The territorial capital had established a monument park honoring civilians who had shown exceptional courage in defending their communities against criminal organizations. The central sculpture depicted figures representing different cultural groups standing together against a common threat, symbolizing the unity that Morrison's defeat had demonstrated was possible. Newspaper editors throughout the Southwest had adopted editorial policies that emphasized community responsibility and civic courage, recognizing that their publications could either encourage or discourage the kind of collective action that had saved Copper Falls. The press had learned that journalism carried moral obligations beyond mere reporting of events. Banking institutions had developed new security protocols based on analysis of Morrison's robbery techniques, implementing measures that made it more difficult for criminal gangs to accumulate the resources necessary for sustained campaigns of terror. The financial industry had recognized that community security was essential for economic development. Territorial governors had established emergency communication systems that allowed threatened communities to summon assistance more quickly than had been possible during Morrison's occupation of Copper Falls. These networks ensured that isolated towns wouldn't face criminal threats without hope of reinforcement from neighboring communities. Military academies had incorporated the tactical lessons of Morrison's defeat into their curricula, teaching future officers that small unit actions could be more effective than large-scale operations when dealing with criminal organizations that relied on mobility and intimidation rather than direct confrontation. The descendants of Morrison's victims had established foundations that provided assistance to families affected by similar crimes, ensuring that future generations would receive support that had not been available during the Outlaw's reign of terror. These organizations carried forward the community solidarity that had made resistance possible. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Mexico had been strengthened by recognition that criminal organizations operating along the border threatened both nations and required cooperative responses. The Torres family's example of cross-cultural friendship had helped establish templates for international cooperation in law enforcement matters. Archaeological expeditions had documented the sites where Morrison's stolen gold had been cached, providing insights into how criminal organizations managed their finances and planned for long-term operations. This research had helped law enforcement agencies understand the economic foundations that supported outlaw gangs. The annual Copper Falls Freedom Festival attracted visitors from throughout the American West who came to hear speeches about civic courage and community responsibility. These gatherings reinforced the lessons that Morrison's defeat had taught about the importance of ordinary citizens taking active roles in defending democratic institutions. Medical schools had established the Henderson Institute for Trauma Treatment, which trained physicians to recognize and treat the psychological as well as physical injuries inflicted by systematic torture and abuse. Dr. Henderson's holistic approach to healing had influenced an entire generation of medical professionals. Law enforcement agencies had developed the Crawford Protocol for community policing, which emphasized the importance of maintaining citizen trust and encouraging civilian participation in crime prevention. Sheriff Crawford's experience with Morrison had demonstrated that isolated law enforcement officers could not protect communities without active public support. Religious seminaries had incorporated the Santos method of crisis ministry into their training programs, teaching future clergy how to provide moral leadership during community emergencies while maintaining the spiritual authority necessary for effective pastoral care. Father Santos's example had shown that religious leaders could inspire courage without abandoning their calling to peace. The Cocheta Foundation had established cultural exchange programs that brought together young people from different ethnic backgrounds to learn about cooperation and mutual respect. These educational initiatives ensured that future generations would understand the importance of unity in the face of threats that targeted entire communities rather than individual groups. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Copper, falls on the 25th anniversary of Morrison's defeat, Lucinda Williams stood in the town square before the memorial statue, her grey hair gleaming in the golden light as she prepared to address the crowd that had gathered for the annual remembrance ceremony. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled faces. Children who had been born long after Morrison's death, adults who remembered the terror and the triumph, elderly survivors who had lived through the transformation. 25 years ago, evil came to our town in the form of a man who believed that fear was stronger than courage, that isolation was stronger than community, that cruelty was stronger than compassion. Lucinda began, her prosecutor's training evident in the careful cadence of her words. He was wrong about everything that mattered, and his defeat taught us lessons that we must never forget and never stop sharing with those who will face similar tests in the future. The crowd listened in respectful silence as Lucinda recounted the story they all knew by heart but needed to hear again. How Cochetta had risked everything to save a stranger, how ordinary townspeople had found extraordinary courage, how community solidarity had triumphed over individual evil. Her words carried the weight of personal experience and the authority of someone who had lived through transformation. The legacy of that terrible day and glorious victory belongs not just to those of us who survived it, but to every generation that will face choices between fear and action, between isolation and community, between accepting injustice and fighting for what is right. Lucinda continued, her eyes moving across faces that reflected the cultural diversity that had made Copper Falls strong. We are all custodians of courage, and we must never let that flame be extinguished by convenience or comfort. As darkness fell over Copper Falls and the memorial ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for all who had suffered and all who had served, the bronze statue of Cochetta drawing her bow seemed to glow in the lamplight, her arrow forever aimed toward a target that represented every future threat to justice and human dignity. The Apache warrior's legacy lived on in the courage of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph through their silence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.